Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Latin American and Caribbean Ethnography Seminar Series. This is our second session of the winter term. And for those of you who haven't joined us previously, this seminar is an initiative hosted by CLACS, which is part of the Institute of Languages, Cultures, and Societies at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. The seminar runs in collaboration with CROLAC, the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean at Queen Mary University, also in London, with CISRUL, the Center for Citizenship, Civil Society, and Rule of Law at the University of Aberdeen, and the Spanish National Research Council. We are three conveners. Ainhoa Montoya, who couldn't join us for this session, my colleague Jessica Sclair, who will be joining very briefly, and myself, Denise Roman. Today we have a very special session. It is run in collaboration with the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Los Andes in Colombia. And so I'm going to hand it over to our colleague Pablo Jaramillo, who will be our chair for today. Over to you, Pablo.
Thanks, Denise. Thanks everyone for being with us. And on behalf of our department, thanks to Denise, to Ainhoa and Jesse for making us part of this exciting seminar. So I'm going to present Ana first. Ana María Ulloa is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. She received her PhD in anthropology from the New School of Social Research in New York. And her work has focused on providing ethnographic accounts of how flavor becomes an object of knowledge and commerce, and the formation of sensory skills in taste and smell laboratories, flavor and fragrance industries, and restaurants. Her articles have appeared in journals such as The Senses and Society, Gastronomica, the Journal of Critical Studies, the Food Culture and Society, and her latest contributions have appeared as chapters in the edited volumes Capitalism and the Senses and Consumer Research Methods in Food Science. So Ana María will present her talk titled Training Chemists and Their Noses Across Fields, the study of tropical fruit aromas in Colombia. Just before you start, Ana, just some housekeeping notes. You will speak for around 30, 40 minutes. And afterwards, we will have a Q&A aiming to finish at 1 p.m. in Colombia, 6 p.m. in the UK. So during the session, please keep your microphones on mute. And if you like to ask questions at the end, please use the raise hand function available on Zoom. And I'll ask you to unmute. So also you can comment and make your question in the comment chat box, and I'll read those out. And we're recording this talk, but not the Q&A session, which will be available on the CLACS website shortly. So Ana María, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you for the invitation, Denise and Jesse. It's really exciting for me to present this work that I'm currently writing about. So any comment right at this stage is also helpful to start thinking, right, of especially the consequences, right, of the case study that I'm going to present for you today. So Pablo mentioned some of the things that I've done, right, in the bio, but I want to give you a little bit of context as to why I ended up interested in following a chemistry group in Bogotá, right, that has worked on analyzing the aroma of tropical fruits for over 20 years. And this follows what I did for my doctoral project, where I took the task of conducting multi-sided ethnography for analyzing flavor as both a sensory and a cultural experience that has been transformed into a techno-scientific object. right? So I was interested in investigating how flavor as an epistemic thing that is an object of manipulation, right? That's very important for me, that it's an object of manipulation. It's not a concept, it's not an idea, it's something that it gets to be worked on, how it gets to be constructed, isolated, measured, and talked about, right? And what are the types of knowledge and the people that are behind this objectification of flavor? So perhaps talking about flavor as an object of knowledge might conjure an image like the one I love it here. Yeah, like this one that I'm showing. And this is a sophisticated dish, right, with distinguished flavors. This is from El Celler de Can Roca, a Spanish high-end restaurant where I did part of my fieldwork. And that this restaurant sort of set the trend for what once was called techno-emotional cuisine, right? But in reality, the most accurate and the closest image to the phenomenon that I'm looking at and that I'm interested is represented in this image on the right. And that is the added flavors that a pasta can take, right? In this case, this comes from a Colombian pasta house called Doria, which had the idea of flavoring pastas with chorizo. I don't know what the Spanish Denise would think about, but of course, right? These products, they contain a lot of the science that I'm interested in following, right? And that's the flavor and fragrance industry. That's where I did a lot of my fieldwork previously. And behind all of this, so there's this science, right? Or better yet, different sciences where the experience of taste, smell, and flavor is of scientific concern, right? And then you have disciplines like molecular biology and chemistry, psychology, neuroscience, and sensory science, and even marketing and experimental cooking, right? So flavor is one of those objects that it's hard to isolate because of its complexity, right? So it's hardly a scientific object, right? It's more an object of commerce because for science, right, you need to really take things by pieces, right? So taste for one on one side, smell on the other, right? And chemosensory sensations on the other hand, and make it a workable project in terms of scientific, right, research. So in going after flavor as a manufacturer object that is simultaneously industrial, scientific, and aesthetic, I've done some ethnographic and documentary work on and with different scientists coming from these backgrounds. And I have now turned to chemistry. So when I returned to Colombia, through a talk that I gave at Universidad Nacional, the same university where this research group comes from, I was introduced by a chemistry professor who is also an STS scholar to the work of this research group at the university that have done really a lot of research on the aroma of tropical fruits since the 1980s. They have done research on fruits like lulo, guava, papayuela, badea, no? And now they're taking more Amazon fruits, right? So they started with something that was like tropical, representative of tropicalness by the 80s, right? Like lulo, for instance. And then now, right, as these fruits become more common in the international market, they're also doing some work on Amazon fruits, for instance. So there were some things about this research group that she, right, the professor that introduced this group to me, emphasized that day. First, that they had a commercial breakthrough in the late 1990s as the group participated in the making of a very successful artificial local blackberry flavor, in Spanish Mora de Castilla, for the Colombian market in conjunction with a Spanish flavor and fragrance house that has that is also based here in Bogota, that has like a branch. Second, that the line of aroma chemistry was opened in 1982 at Universidad Nacional and continues to this day, right? So it's not something that just happened and dwindled, but that it's been like a solid research area, which is not as common for a Latin American chemistry lab, right? So La Nacional is really one of a kind in having this line of research for chemistry. And that the leaders of this group, this is the third point, have all been women, very prominent scientists, and most of the students that had gone through the research groups were women as well. To the point that in at a time she told me they were called las chicas de los aromas. So there was like a gender issue going on, right? Of why this object of science or of knowledge attracts more women than men, right? Is there some relationship between like heightened sensory or olfactory skills that women show that is represented in the science that they do, right? Then not only they were only women, but despite having this success, for instance, with a commercial product, because it's applied work, then there's also some sort of hierarchy, right, in the chemistry department between theoretical work and applied work. So they were, right, like sort of dismissed because this was mainly applied and for a concrete industry. So I, of course, became interested in who these chemists were, right? What were their professional trajectories? Why mostly women? What did their research consisted of? And how did tropical fruits became scientific objects? And particularly, given my previous interest in and multi-sided ethnography in industry and science lab, how and why did they ended up collaborating with the local and flavor fragrance industry in Colombia, no? Under what conditions? So that's kind of like how it started. And when I looked them up online, I found a few traces of their work, and that the Mora de Castilla flavor that became a hit in the local market, and it was incorporated in a famous lollipop, but also in yogurts and other commercial foodstuffs, was reported in the local press, right? So we have here a small news that appears in El Tiempo, the major newspaper of Colombia, and this is in 2004, right? Almost 10 years after it had happened, right? The thing, but obviously, even if this is like a small news, right, of these chemists that are understanding the tropical fruits aromas, it's still, right, something that showed up that left a trace. But as we ethnographers know, headlines are usually not what is worth pursuing for our research, right? But rather what is less evident or less visible, what is left behind. And it was in my talking to people from this research group, right? I conducted this work because this is something that happened in the past, is based more on interviews, right? And the narratives of these people participating in this research group. And now they are all over the country and even abroad, right? Doing different trajectories, some still attached to flavor or aroma, and others a little bit different. But what was important that in those conversations that I was having with people, it was not the product that was brought to my attention, but rather a process, right? And the process was this form of olfactory training for students of chemistry that took them out of the laboratory and into the industry, right? And this is what I'll be talking about, this olfactory training that was part of this research group. So while these are skills that do not figure in their public publications, methodological reports, or science handbooks, right? They publish a book that is called El Aroma Frutal de Colombia, and then you have, right, like summary of all the things that they have found for each group, the compounds, right? The chemical compounds and the proportions and what are the precursors, but they don't speak about their methodology, right? And there's no mention of this training, for instance. So through as an STS lens, these skills, right, that are intrinsic and are a memorable part of this research group. I mean, people remember that training fondly and talked about it, right? In these terms, confirm that the role of apprenticeship and the transmission of a kind of craft knowledge is essential for the creative work of science, right? And various ethnographies of laboratories, right, that privilege the view of science in the making, right? So when we go and do ethnographies in a lab, they have precisely focused on this type of manual training and skilled practice that is essential for laboratory work, right? And these studies have paid particular attention to instances of skilled vision, right? So vision, it's sort of the thing that comes out as something that gets to be trained. But as much as everyday scientific practices depend greatly on seeing, visualizing, representing, right, the graphs, right, and science studies is filled with metaphors about the visual in knowledge making, the emphasis on the embodied nature of knowledge making has also forced the field to look beyond vision, right? So now, in the last decades, we have witnessed growing interest in the study of non-visual senses in the conduction of science and experimentation. And some of these studies are studying or are paying attention to how scientists or doctors or engineers listen, touch, right, taste or smell as a way of acquiring knowledge about an area of research subjects and develop sensory skills that are fundamental for such task. No? And chemistry is a particular field in science to study the role of the senses, right? Other than vision. And this is for many reasons, right? Here we have that the comparison between biology and physics, and look what shows up, right? That chemistry stinks. So chemistry is above all a laboratory science. So that takes us to the manual work, like the importance of manipulation, right? Over concepts or only, right, working with formulas and such. And their identity of chemistry, is attached to the manipulation of materials and the use of instruments. If I would have put, chemistry image in Google, you see that scientists with a beaker of some color, very flashy, right? Red, yellow, or blue, sort of showing. So there's always that manipulation of materials. Second, chemistry is a practical science that has a foot in the most diverse fields of industry, right? And in the world. And everything that we have in our desk is made out of something that comes from chemistry, right? So that food in that practical science also makes it a place that is very prominent to study the role of the senses, right? In knowledge making and manipulation. And the senses have played an important role in the making and teaching of chemistry. This is important, even if it has diminished with time, right? Now we're going to see that there's like a lot of work that has seen how this role of the senses has sort of dwindled with more instrumentation and with more machines, right? And with another view of chemistry that wants to be a little bit closer to physics and than to, the work of the lab. And this role of the senses is something that is discussed by chemists themselves, right? For instance, at Universidad Nacional, in conversations that I've had with chemist professors, I was told that there's kind of like two schools. The ones that still think that laboratory work is essential for the teaching of chemistry, that that students need to manipulate materials and learn a lot of skills that are embodied. No, it's not like you can do, if any one of you has done some laboratory work For instance, when I was doing field work in a smell lab, I remember when they told me, okay, you run the experiment and then go and do these things with the pipette. I don't know if that's the way you call it in English, pipette, and 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 it was extremely hard, and I was a mess, right? And I did all kind of mistakes because there's a know-how always, right? And in chemistry classrooms, you see that know-how is it passes down, right? Of this is the way that Professor, X sort of likes to do things, or this is the way that Professor. But of course, this, as I said before, no, it doesn't get mentioned in a handbook, right? It's like those recipes, right? Close to alchemy, right? Um, so you have in the chemistry lab a procedure, right? You have to follow, but a lot of the things of how to do that, right? Of don't we might tell you just pour over 20 milliliters of X liquid, but not that you have to sort of do certain things for it to be efficient, right? So this then became something that that people talk, and that I've been following some conversations, as I was telling you, where you have the other camp of telling, no, we can't be this wasteful, right? Having a laboratory, having people do things with with things that can be possible harmful for the environment. It's not ethical. So really, it's okay if students just see a model, for instance, right, or a video, and they don't do the experiments themselves. So you have those two camps of that, and this discussion, right, of what is the role of the senses. It's something that for instance, this chemist Michelle Frank, she wrote in an opinion piece for Nature like 10 years ago. For better or for worse, we were once more intimate with our materials, right? Um, Over the past 30 years, right, she says, chemists have avoided both in their laboratories and in their reports the smells and taste of compounds. Not only is the smell of compounds poorly described or described at all, she says, but also even when volatile compounds are the object of research, there is little mention of the person or people doing the smelling. Today, learning how to smell or how to describe an odor does not seem to be part of the typical chemistry education. And in fact, right, the death of the census chemist, to use Lisa Roberts' clever title for an article she wrote in 1995, has been declared since the end of the 18th century amid the introduction of new laboratory apparatuses and technologies that reinforce this quantitative approach to experimentation. However, despite this, right, as Roberts herself acknowledged in that piece, chemists have not stopped smelling, touching, and tasting as part of the laboratory practice, right? Sensory practices, as Cornu, another historian of science, argues, can still find a place in the modern laboratory, even when there's not explicit concern for teaching students, right, how to smell. So knowing this debate, I became interested in learning more about how this became something important for this Colombian research group and what were the consequences of such training beyond the laboratory. And I'm still thinking about the consequences, right? Of why would it be important to have that type of training in a science education? So studies of tropical fruits in the Department of Chemistry at Universidad Nacional started in the mid-1970s through a program that was financed by the OES, the Organization of American States. And the objective of this research, which was led by Crisólogo Camargo, the man below, this picture below, was to support the proper use of and cultivation and storage of these fruits that were intended to export, right? Particular to the European market. And so basically, right, they needed to, at the beginning, when Aroma aroma is very difficult, and you'll see why. They were doing studies around color of the fruits, right? Of how they ripen and how can we measure that ripening in changes in color or in some compounds that they could measure, right? And so the reason was economic, right? Was as chemistry is an utility science, right? And with these resources from the OAS, the chemistry department acquired important equipment for chemical analysis and isolation of compounds, such as the gas chromatograph, which would later enable that research on fruits aromas, right? And that research was taken on by Carmen Saluque, which is the chemist, the woman that we see above, which was Chrysologo's student and who obtained a PhD in chemistry from Tokyo's Technology Institute in 1979, which was a rarity at a time. Carmenza is one of the leading chemists of the country. She was part of the Misión de Sabios that just happened. And she started this research line for master's students in 1982. When I talked to Carmenza, she has two research groups running, right? One, it's on marine, right, like sea creatures and marine products, and the other one was on aromas. And the aromas was more like a inheritance that she got from her previous professor, right? That where he was, Carmenza, you have to take this, you know the techniques, and the thing is that fruit aromas and uh, um, marine animals, right? Marine products, as chemistry says, they can be analyzed using the same equipment, right? So Carmenza became one of the leading chemists in analytical chemistry and in running gas chromatographs. And actually, the first scientist who obtained, and this is sort of trivia, but I think, it speaks of something that looks very minor, but then it's quite important. The first scientist that obtained a PhD in Colombia in 1993 comes from this group. And it was a woman, and she did the dissertation on the aroma of lulo under Duque's guidance. The thing with tropical fruits, so research on aromas, fruit aromas, right? It is widespread, no? And as I told you, the chemistry of aroma especially has been done in the US, Germany, and Japan, right? They're sort of the leading places. So that Carmenza has an education in Japan matters, right? And then the people that they interact they have a lot of connections with Germany and some with the States later. But tropical fruits were, let's say, a little bit understudied, or the most common were, pineapple or mango or this type of fruits. And in terms of their complexity, or in, how they depart from other fruits, is that tropical fruits have some sort of funk. If you smell a papaya, you know what I mean, right? Like, yeah, and it depends on when, if the papaya is overripe, then you have some unpleasant notes, and it's because along some of the esters and lactic compounds that are very prevalent in all fruits, tropical fruits are characterized by containing some sulfurous volatile compounds, and sulfurous compounds provide that juicy, fresh, authentic aroma of many varieties of tropical fruits. And these are compounds that are not as easy to isolate, right? Because they might come at very, very low concentrations. Volatile compounds are like minuscule, we're talking about billions in parts per billion. So, and then you have these compounds that are even more, very subtle, very subtle. So it's hard to isolate. So a lot of the progress that has come in this area in aroma chemistry has been obtained by the improvement and sophistication of measurement and isolation techniques and instruments. This is what a gas chromatograph looks like, right? This machine that it's gets more sophisticated with time, and the analytical techniques, right? So this is a group that it's really at the forefront of analytical techniques in chemistry because of the subject matter, right? That might look too mundane or too, industry related, but that is very difficult to manipulate. And on top of that, it's not that these machines can just, that you inject a sample and then these machines will give you the results, a chromatograph. I might have a picture. I don't remember if I put it, but it's not like they will just show, what's in the fruit, what are the compounds. To identify it, right? These machines can, or at least, they can do some of the work, and the libraries are getting more specialized, especially with, data science. But there has to be someone at the end smelling, right? That's the thing. There has to be someone smelling and identifying compounds, not only by their formula or their chemical attributes, but by their olfactory notes. So you need to have chemists to learn, what an olfactory note, to distinguish between something that is fruity or grassy or sweet, right? And hence the need of training. So they had to organize, and this is coming from a group, that we have to understand also that the relationships between industry and science, despite the fact that, in chemistry is something that would come natural, they're very hard to achieve. And in a country like Colombia, they're even harder, right? So while in the States and while in Europe, right, and Japan, a lot of this research has come from industry and it's supporting. In Colombia, it's coming from a public university with few resources, no? And with an industry that here we have somehow flavor and fragrance houses, but they function more in terms of application and not development, right? So the big research, it's happening in the global north. So there's a lot of, I think, merit to what they were doing that, might look like something very simple. And describing smell seems almost as difficult as describing air, right? Writes Anna Singh on smelling in her on her famous ethnography on the Matsutake. This we know by experience, and for scientists, this reality is not different, right? So when I talked to Alicia, one of the leaders, she said, Lucta Gran Colombiana, that's the name of the flavor and fragrance company, taught us scientists how to smell. We didn't do it ourselves, right? This is an image, it's not, of the company that had, that I picked from online, because of course I had there's no depiction of that process, right? And they don't have, I've asked if they had some pictures of when they went to but I still haven't had the chance to get some. So this is where the title comes from, right? Training chemists across fields, right? So the only way of acquiring grounded knowledge is by being around those who know. That's what Polanyi said when talking about tacit knowledge, right? And olfactory training needs willingness, right? You have to care. Otherwise, it's something that might not be too, that you might not do progress. Attention, constant repetitions, materials to smell, a vocabulary, and a guiding nose. Actually, a guiding noses in the plural. So students and professors brought their willingness and attention, and the flavor company provided the rest. Students came every Monday morning for 2 hours to smell and taste, or both, 5 to 6 vials containing carefully chosen odor molecules diluted in liquid solutions pertaining to a single family. Floral, sweet, fruity, etc. Afterwards, they described each odor or taste, annotating memories or associations they attached to each smell and the molecule's chemical structure. They were guided by the company's head flavorist, who, besides providing the substances, taught them how to name them using the industry's lexicon. The train lasted around 3 to 6 months. So this is something that happened right in these late 90s for some times. And from the industry's point of view, I conducted interviews with the people from the industry side. Training the students how to smell was mandatory because they knew it is something that is not taught at the university. Luis Eduardo Riaño, the technical director and head of quality control at LUCTA, considered that before starting to speak of volatile compounds and chromatographs, chemistry students needed to comprehend and attend to their olfactory memories. So we're bringing a subjective element, right, to this training. So this basic principle of linking a smell to a specific episodic memory is at the basis of flavorists and perfumers' practice. And it is precisely this subjective principle what makes sensory observations trustful on the first place. Moreover, for Riaño, the sensory training that they could provide students was necessary to ensure they could speak the same language, since to render something nameable is to render shareable, right? And here are some of the words that a former student of the group, who now is a professor of chemistry and teaches aroma chemistry at Universidad Nacional, told me. We were very lucky to have had the opportunity with LUCTA. That training helped us a lot because we got to the point where we could all say the same word associated with a particular smell. And reaching that degree of agreement is spectacular because it allows the sensory results to be reproducible, which is perhaps the most difficult thing in science that is based on sensory perceptions. Sensory science requires a lot of training, a lot of discipline, very judicious panelists and a group, so that when the results are finally obtained, they are not so dispersed. That allows you to say, yes, what you smell is this and nothing else. In sensory science, what is hard is that training, having a trained group. So this trained group is what sociologists Antonio Genion and Geneviève Thiel called a taste community, or it could be understood as such, one that can maintain a common frame of reference and initiate new members as necessary. The training at LUCTA did not continue after the agreement between them and the university. After that agreement ended, but nonetheless, the need for olfactory training remained an important characteristic for conducting research in the aroma group. In Latour's, I want to see this time. I'm almost done. So in Latour, there's an example that he uses in a famous article that talks about the body of a training kit for perfumers that perfumers use. And he says that the kit is coextensive with the body, right? That in explaining how the students' bodies learn to be affected, and after a training session, the kit, right? Those vials that contain odors, they make the odor appear as something other, right? So the other kits make students act on each substance, as well as speak and articulate their perception for communicating with others. But besides the kit, it is important to note that for the training of noses to yield significant results, the training must not be done in isolation. A student, for example, remarked on the difference between training in an American laboratory and training in this research group in Colombia. She said to me, in the United States, sensory training consisted in basically each person smelling their extract or sample as many times as they could and trying to describe it as best as possible. But training one's own only reaches so far. The basis of sensory training relies on communication, on the ability to speak of something that makes sense to somebody else. So learning how to smell is thus, as Lloyd Wacan signaled for boxing, something whose adequate apprenticeship is quintessentially collective, right? Learning how to trap, identify, name, and of course quantify is a big part of attending to smells in a techno-scientific context. As we saw in this example, there was much profit from learning across fields for students and professors alike to travel every morning to a flavor and fragrance house at the city outskirts just to smell, and not each of them alone in their laboratory, filled with these machines. And as Geneviève Thiel, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, has written, French, olfactory training is never once and for all an acquired skill, right? So this is something that has to be repeated. You may know the theory, right? You may know that there's olfactory families, that there's fruity, that there's sweet, but without constant training, without the constant smelling, the skill of knowing how to smell will be lost. So training is an act of repetition. Perhaps it is for this reason that training is sometimes contraposed to education, in the same line as the opposite as oppositions of the kind of hand versus mind, or practice versus theory, or skill versus practice, right? So there's a debate that this case brings. But learning how to smell is not a mechanical exercise. Even if it is a skill that is mastered through repetition, it requires attention and expanding vocabulary and a common purpose, right? You learn to smell for something with someone. So in the scientific context, and particularly that of science education, I see that paying attention to smells has two important purposes, right? Those consequences that I told you at the beginning that I'm thinking about. So one I see as a way of self-cultivation. As Latour proposed, right, thinking about perfumers, it is a way to acquire a body and to become articulate, right? To gain a world and a body simultaneously. For instance, the students that recently took the aroma chemistry class told me afterward how much attentive they were now to their environment, from noting what a particular product contained to what their grandmother's cooking, consisted of or had. This is cultivation of the arts of noticing, I would argue, using Anna Singh's term, or what we could also term the cultivation of qualitative care in the practice of science. True, quantitative progress does not usually sit easy with qualitative care. But I think this example shows how there is something here that brings elements of an aesthetic education, right? That it's sensible to materials via industrial means that is brought to a scientific education. And as Tim Ingold notes, drawing from a very different ethnographic context, as long as there is hands-on engagement with materials in making, or we could say, nose-on engagement, sensitivity and sentience do not necessarily need to be in opposition to technological enhancements or scientific knowledge. And the second thing that I think, this learning how to smell does is building a community of practice, right? And here, of course, communication of the sort that I discussed is key. Learning how to smell is part of finding methods to objectively determine and measure the sensory qualities of things such as fruits, aromas. The focus on the acquisition of olfactory skills, as I have done here, underscores the idea that it is through practice that communities of practitioners get to share tacit and explicit knowledge. Yes, right? But also similar values, norms, and self-understanding. More than a cultivation of keen senses, right, that can be understood as passive receptors or body discipline, scientific practice calls for the development of interpretative and active eyes, noses, tongues, ears, and skin that will become a part of a network of instruments, aromas, right, and shareable data. So this is what I have so far of, why would be this important and what would be some of the consequences. So I'm eager to hear if you have some questions or ideas or anything of the sort.
Thanks, Anna.